In the twilight hours of January 30th, 1933, as Adolf Hitler ascended to the position of Chancellor of Germany, the seeds of one of history's most notorious secret police forces were sown. Within weeks, on April 26, 1933, Hermann Göring, Hitler's trusted lieutenant and Minister President of Prussia, established the Geheime Staatspolizei, better known by its chilling abbreviation, the Gestapo. This pivotal moment occurred in the opulent halls of the Prussian Ministry of the Interior in Berlin, where Göring, resplendent in his Nazi uniform, signed the decree that would forever change the face of German society. The formation of this sinister organization was not merely a bureaucratic reshuffling, but the birth of a tool that would become synonymous with terror and oppression. Göring, with his imposing figure and piercing gaze, declared the Gestapo's purpose in no uncertain terms. The only man who still has private affairs in Germany is somebody who is asleep. This ominous pronouncement set the stage for an era of unprecedented surveillance and control. Initially confined to Prussia, the largest state in Germany, the Gestapo's reach soon expanded. On April 20th, 1934, in a calculated move that coincided with Hitler's 45th birthday, the ambitious and ruthless Heinrich Himmler assumed control of the organization. Himmler, with his wire-rimmed glasses and unremarkable appearance, belied the cold calculation that lay beneath. He swiftly set about reorganizing and expanding the Gestapo's operations, integrating it into the broader SS apparatus. Under Himmler's meticulous guidance, the Gestapo's tentacles spread across the entirety of the German Reich. By 1935, its headquarters had been established at 8 Prinz Albrecht Strasse in Berlin, a building that would become infamous as the nerve center of Nazi repression. The nondescript facade of this structure masked the horrors that transpired within its walls, where countless individuals were interrogated, tortured, and often disappeared without a trace. One such victim was the celebrated German journalist Karl von Ossietzky, who was arrested in 1933 and subjected to brutal treatment in Gestapo custody before being sent to a concentration camp. One of the most infamous Gestapo operations took place on July 20th, 1944, in the aftermath of the failed assassination attempt on Hitler. In a sweeping action known as Operation Valkyrie, the Gestapo arrested over 7,000 people suspected of involvement in the plot. This crackdown demonstrated the organization's efficiency and the extent of its intelligence network. Among those arrested was Claus von Stauffenberg's brother, Berthold, who was subjected to a brutal interrogation before being executed by slow strangulation at Plötzensee prison on August 10, 1944. The organization's influence extended into every facet of German society. Even the realm of culture was not immune. In a particularly chilling episode, the Gestapo arrested the renowned theologian and resistance member Dietrich Bonhoeffer on April 5, 1943. Bonhoeffer's powerful words, "Silence in the face of evil is itself evil," stand as a testament to the courage of those who dared to resist. His arrest took place at his parents' home in Berlin, and he was taken to Tegel prison, where he continued to write and minister to fellow prisoners until his execution on April 9, 1945, just weeks before the war's end. As the war progressed, the Gestapo's methods became increasingly desperate and brutal. In the final months of the conflict, they implemented the Volkssturm decree, forcibly conscripting men between 16 and 60 years old into last-ditch militia units. Those who refused faced summary execution. In one harrowing incident in Cologne on March 1, 1945, Gestapo officers publicly hanged 6 teenagers who had refused to join the Volkssturm, leaving their bodies on display as a warning to others. The whispers in the shadows, unveiling the Gestapo's web of terror. In the dimly lit streets of 1930s Berlin, a chill ran through the air that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the cold grip of fear, a constant companion to those living under the watchful eye of the Gestapo. Within months of its creation, the Gestapo had already arrested over 25,000 political opponents, setting the tone for the years of terror to come. The Gestapo's methods were as varied as they were insidious. At the heart of their operation lay an extensive network of informants, estimated to number around 150,000 by 1939. These were not just hardened Nazi loyalists, but ordinary citizens, your neighbor, your colleague, perhaps even your own family member. As one former Gestapo officer chillingly remarked, "We had specialists for all human weaknesses." This network was so pervasive that it was said there was one Gestapo informant for every 180 citizens in Berlin. The novelist Hans Fallada captured this atmosphere in his book Every Man Dies Alone, based on the true story of Otto and Elise Hampel, who dared to resist by leaving anonymous postcards criticizing the Nazi regime around Berlin. This web of surveillance created a society where trust was a luxury few could afford. In cafes, on street corners, even within the sanctity of one's own home, every conversation was potentially overheard, every action scrutinized. The writer Sebastian Haffner, who lived through this period, described the atmosphere in his memoir, Defying Hitler. The most striking characteristic of life in the Third Reich was its utter unpredictability. The only predictable thing was that something unpredictable would happen. This unpredictability was exemplified by the fate of Pastor Martin Niemöller, who initially supported the Nazi regime but was later imprisoned for 7 years in concentration camps for his opposition to Hitler's control over the churches. The Gestapo's headquarters at 8 Prinz Albrechtstrasse in Berlin became synonymous with terror. Behind its unassuming facade, countless individuals were subjected to brutal interrogations and torture. One of the most notorious interrogators was Klaus Barbie, known as the Butcher of Lyon. Barbie's methods were so brutal that even some of his Nazi colleagues were appalled. One of his victims, Lisa Lesèvre, testified years later about her ordeal. Day and night, exposed, 13 days without food, almost no water, electricity, freezing showers, beatings. Barbie was responsible for the deaths of an estimated 14,000 people, including the capture and deportation of 44 Jewish children from an orphanage in Isieux, France, in 1944. But physical torture was just one tool in the Gestapo's arsenal. Psychological manipulation was equally effective. The enhanced interrogation techniques developed by the Gestapo included sleep deprivation, isolation, and the notorious cold cell treatment. Prisoners would be kept in freezing dark cells for extended periods, their minds slowly unraveling in the oppressive silence. These methods were meticulously documented in the so-called Gestapo Handbook, a chilling manual that outlined various interrogation techniques. One particularly cruel method was the Sonderbehandlung, or special treatment, a euphemism for execution without trial. The Gestapo's reach extended far beyond the interrogation room. They were masters of creating an atmosphere of perpetual fear and uncertainty. The Night and Fog Decree, Nacht- und Nebel-Erlass, issued on December 7, 1941, allowed the Gestapo to make people disappear without a trace. Suspected resistance members would be arrested in the dead of night, spirited away to concentration camps, leaving their families with no information about their fate. This decree affected an estimated 7,000 people, many of whom were never seen again. The famous French resistance leader, Jean Moulin, fell victim to this decree, disappearing into the night after his arrest in 1943. This tactic was devastatingly effective in suppressing opposition. As the German pastor Martin Niemöller famously reflected, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." Niemöller himself was arrested by the Gestapo in 1937 and spent the next 7 years in concentration camps. The Gestapo's methods were not confined to Germany. In occupied territories, they worked with local collaborators to root out resistance. In France, the Carlingue, or French Gestapo, led by Henri Lafont, became notorious for their brutal efficiency. Operating from 93 Rue Lauriston in Paris, they turned the elegant townhouse into a center of torture and terror. The building became known as La Maison de la Gestapo, and it's estimated that over 400 resistance fighters were tortured there. One of their most infamous acts was the roundup and deportation of 13,000 Jews in Paris on July 16, 1942, known as the Veil d'Hiv Roundup. The Gestapo's role in implementing the Holocaust cannot be overstated. They were instrumental in coordinating deportations and hunting down Jews in hiding. On August 4, 1944, acting on an anonymous tip, the Gestapo raided the secret annex where Anne Frank and her family had been hiding for 2 years. The raid was led by SS Oberscharführer Karl Josef Silberbauer, who later recalled the moment he discovered the young diarist. "I saw a young girl standing there. She looked at me with big eyes. It was a moment I will never forget." The Gestapo's efficiency in this task was horrifying. In the Netherlands alone, they managed to capture an estimated 25,000 Jews who were in hiding. The legacy of the Gestapo's methods lingered long after the war. Many of their interrogation techniques were adopted and refined by other regimes and intelligence agencies. The psychological scars left on survivors and their families persisted for generations. As Primo Levi, an Auschwitz survivor, wrote in his memoir, The Drowned and the Saved, "We who survived the camps are not true witnesses. We, the survivors, are not only an exiguous, but also an anomalous minority. We are those who, by their prevarications or abilities or good luck, did not touch bottom. Those who did so, those who saw the Gorgon, have not returned to tell about it, or have returned mute." The architects of fear, masterminds behind Hitler's secret police. In the shadowy corridors of Nazi power, where ambition and brutality intertwined, a cadre of men rose to infamy as the architects of one of history's most feared organizations. These were not mere bureaucrats, but the masterminds who shaped an apparatus of terror that would cast a long, dark shadow over 20th century Europe. Their legacy would prompt philosopher Hannah Arendt to coin the phrase, the banality of evil, encapsulating how ordinary individuals could commit extraordinary atrocities. At the pinnacle of this sinister hierarchy stood Heinrich Müller, the enigmatic head of the Gestapo from 1939 until its dissolution in 1945. Known as Gestapo Müller to distinguish him from other officials with the same common German surname, Müller's path to power was as unexpected as it was ruthless. Born in Munich on April 28, 1900, Müller began his career as a police officer in Bavaria, initially opposing the Nazi Party. Yet by 1934, he had thrown his lot in with Hitler's regime, quickly rising through the ranks with a cold efficiency that became his trademark. Müller's transformation from opponent to zealot was so complete that by 1936, he was heading the Gestapo's political department, directly overseeing the suppression of all opposition to the Nazi regime. Under his leadership, the Gestapo's methods became increasingly brutal and sophisticated. One of his subordinates later recalled, "Müller was a bureaucrat to his fingertips. He was the kind of man who could sign the death warrant for 1,000 people, then go home and sleep like a baby." This cold detachment was evident in Müller's meticulous record-keeping. He personally kept a death book, listing executions he had ordered, which was found to contain over 1,100 names by the war's end. But Müller was not alone in shaping the Gestapo into the fearsome organization it became. Reinhard Heydrich played a pivotal role in the early years of the Gestapo. Born on March 7, 1904, in Halle an der Saale, Heydrich's rise to power was meteoric. By 1931, at the age of 27, he had caught the eye of Heinrich Himmler, who tasked him with creating a security service for the Nazi Party, the embryonic form of what would become the SD, Sicherheitsdienst, and later the Gestapo. Heydrich's ambition was legendary, prompting his contemporary, Walter Schellenberg, to remark, "He was a man of split personalities, unpredictable, ambitious to the point of disease." Heydrich's vision for the Gestapo was all-encompassing. He sought to create not just a police force, but an intelligence network that would penetrate every aspect of German society. Under his guidance, the Gestapo developed its infamous card index system, meticulously documenting real and perceived enemies of the Reich. By 1939, this index contained over 7 million names. The system was so detailed that it included categories for incurable patients, Jews, Jehovah's Witnesses, and even miscellaneous friendly contacts, demonstrating the extent of the Gestapo's reach into private lives. On September 27, 1939, Heydrich's influence reached its zenith with the creation of the Reich Main Security Office, which brought together the Gestapo, the SD, and the criminal police under one umbrella. This consolidation of power made the apparatus of state terror more efficient and deadly than ever before. It was Heydrich who, on September 21, 1939, convened a meeting of the heads of the Einsatzgruppen, outlining the plan for the house cleaning of Jews, intelligentsia, and other undesirables in Poland, a precursor to the wholesale genocide that would follow. Heydrich's brutal efficiency earned him many enemies, and on May 27, 1942, he was assassinated by Czech resistance fighters in Prague. His death sparked a wave of reprisals, including the complete destruction of the village of Lidice and the murder of its inhabitants. Even in death, Heydrich's legacy of terror lived on. Hitler eulogized him as the man with the iron heart, a chilling tribute to his ruthlessness. Another key figure in the Gestapo's hierarchy was Heinrich Müller's deputy, Werner Best. Born on July 10, 1903 in Darmstadt, Best was the intellectual force behind much of the Gestapo's legal and organizational structure. A trained lawyer, he provided the pseudo-legal framework that allowed the Gestapo to operate outside the bounds of conventional law. Best famously stated, "As long as the police carries out the will of the leadership, it is acting legally." This philosophy was enshrined in the Gestapo Law of February 10, 1936, which placed the organization above judicial review and essentially gave it carte blanche to operate as it saw fit. Best's influence extended beyond Germany's borders. In 1940, he was appointed Reich Plenipotentiary in Denmark, where he implemented the Nazi occupation with a mix of political maneuvering and brutal repression. His tenure saw the roundup and deportation of Danish Jews, though notably, due to Danish resistance and Best's complex political calculations, a significant number managed to escape to neutral Sweden. In a twist of historical irony, Best's actions in Denmark would later be used as evidence by his defense lawyers to argue that he had tried to moderate Nazi policies, a claim that remains highly controversial among historians. The operational effectiveness of the Gestapo owed much to men like Klaus Barbie, the infamous Butcher of Lyon. Born on October 25, 1913 in Bad Godesberg, Barbie joined the SD in 1935 and quickly gained a reputation for sadistic interrogation methods. In November 1942, he was posted to Lyon, France, where his brutality reached new heights. Barbie was responsible for the torture and murder of countless resistance fighters and Jews. One of his most notorious acts was the raid on a children's home in Isieux on April 6, 1944, where 44 Jewish children were arrested and subsequently deported to Auschwitz. None survived. Among his victims was Jean Moulin, a prominent leader of the French resistance who died under Barbie's torture in 1943. Barbie's actions in Lyon were so extreme that even some of his Nazi colleagues were appalled. After the war, he famously evaded justice for decades, escaping to Bolivia with the help of US intelligence services before finally being extradited to France in 1983 to face trial for his crimes. The Gestapo's reach extended into every corner of occupied Europe, and figures like Karl Eberhard Schöngarth played crucial roles in implementing Nazi policies in conquered territories. Born on April 22, 1903, in Leipzig, Schöngarth was appointed commander of the security police and SD in the General Government, occupied Poland, in 1941. He was one of the attendees at the infamous Wannsee Conference on January 20, 1942, where the details of the final solution were discussed. At this meeting, Schongarth represented the general government, actively participating in the planning of the Holocaust. Schongarth's tenure in Poland was marked by extreme violence. He oversaw numerous mass executions, including the murder of Polish intellectuals and resistance members. One particularly brutal operation under his command was the AB Action, Extraordinary Pacification Operation, in 1940, which saw the murder of over 6,500 Polish intellectuals and political leaders. In July 1944, he was transferred to the Netherlands, where he continued his brutal campaign against resistance fighters and Jews in hiding. Schongarth's actions epitomized the Gestapo's role in implementing the Nazi regime's most genocidal policies. As the war drew to a close, many of these key Gestapo figures met varied fates. Heinrich Müller disappeared in the chaos of Berlin's fall in May 1945, his ultimate fate remaining one of the great mysteries of the post-war era. Despite numerous theories and alleged sightings, no conclusive evidence of his survival or death has ever been found. Werner Best was arrested by British forces in Denmark and extradited to Germany, where he faced multiple trials, but ultimately received relatively light sentences. The Invisible Hand of Genocide, unmasking the Gestapo's role in the Holocaust. In the annals of human history, few organizations have left as dark a stain as the Gestapo, Hitler's secret state police. While often overshadowed by the more visible SS in popular narratives of the Holocaust, the Gestapo's role in the systematic extermination of millions was both crucial and chilling. Their invisible hand reached into every corner of Nazi-occupied Europe, weaving a web of terror that ensnared millions of Jews, Roma, political dissidents, and other targeted groups. The story of the Gestapo's involvement in the Holocaust begins in the early 1930s, even before the infamous Wannsee Conference of January 20th, 1942, where the final solution was officially set in motion. As early as 1933, the Gestapo, under the leadership of Rudolf Diels, began compiling extensive lists of Jews and other undesirables. These lists, meticulously maintained and constantly updated, would become the roadmap for future deportations and exterminations. In Berlin alone, by 1939, the Gestapo had files on over 50,000 individuals deemed threats to the Reich. Heinrich Müller, who would later become the Gestapo's chief, perfected the art of creating these comprehensive dossiers known as Personenakten. The Gestapo's methods were as varied as they were brutal. In November 1938, during the infamous Kristallnacht pogrom, Gestapo officers coordinated with SS and SA units to arrest over 30,000 Jewish men. These arrests marked the beginning of mass incarcerations in concentration camps. Reinhard Heydrich, then head of the Gestapo, issued orders that would seal the fate of countless Jews. As soon as the course of events during this night allows the assigned officers to be used for this purpose, as many Jews, particularly affluent Jews, are to be arrested in all districts as can be accommodated in existing detention facilities. In Vienna alone, 6,547 Jews were arrested that night. Among them was Simon Wiesenthal, who would later become a famous Nazi hunter. As the war progressed and the Nazi regime's genocidal aims intensified, the Gestapo's role expanded. They became the primary enforcers of the Nuremberg laws and other anti-Semitic legislation. In occupied territories, Gestapo units worked tirelessly to identify, arrest and deport Jews to ghettos and concentration camps. The infamous Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units that followed the German army into Eastern Europe, included many Gestapo officers in their ranks. One such officer, Friedrich Jeckeln, personally oversaw the murder of over 100,000 Jews in Ukraine, including the infamous Babi Yar massacre on September 29, 1941, where 33,771 Jews were killed in just 2 days. One of the most sinister aspects of the Gestapo's involvement was their role in hunting down Jews in hiding. The story of Anne Frank and her family, betrayed to the Gestapo on August 4, 1944, after 2 years in hiding, is perhaps the most well-known example, but there were countless others. In Amsterdam, the Gestapo employed a group of Jewish collaborators known as the Hennecke Column to hunt down Jews in hiding. This group, led by Wim Hennecke, was responsible for the capture of thousands of Jews, receiving a bounty for each one. In France, the Gestapo worked closely with local collaborators to round up Jews. The infamous Vel d'Hiv roundup in Paris on July 16, 1942, saw over 13,000 Jews arrested, including more than 4,000 children. Gestapo officer Kurt Lischke oversaw this operation, earning him the nickname Butcher of Paris. Survivor Sarah Lichtstein-Montar recalled, "We were hunted down like animals." The Gestapo's reach extended far beyond the initial arrests. They were instrumental in managing the complex logistics of the Holocaust. Trains filled with deportees to concentration camps were often accompanied by Gestapo officers. At the camps themselves, Gestapo personnel were frequently present, overseeing selections and interrogations. Adolf Eichmann, perhaps the most infamous Gestapo officer associated with the Holocaust, played a crucial role in organizing these deportations. His chilling efficiency led him to boast, "I will leap into my grave laughing, because the feeling that I have 5 million human beings on my conscience is for me a source of extraordinary satisfaction." Eichmann's meticulous planning ensured that trains ran on time, even as Allied bombing disrupted rail networks. In one instance, he arranged for children to be deported from the Drancy internment camp near Paris to Auschwitz on August 17, 1944, just days before the liberation of Paris. The Gestapo's methods of extracting information and maintaining control were notoriously brutal. Torture was commonplace in their interrogation rooms. In the Warsaw Ghetto, Gestapo headquarters at Aleje Sucha 25 became known as a place of unspeakable horrors. Survivors spoke of screams echoing through the building day and night. One Warsaw Ghetto fighter, Marek Edelman, later recalled, "We knew that from Sucha Street there was only one way out, to Pawiak prison, and from there to the camps." The Gestapo's techniques included sleep deprivation, beatings, and the notorious standing cells, where prisoners were forced to stand for days on end in pitch-black, coffin-like spaces. As the tide of war turned against Nazi Germany, the Gestapo's actions became even more frenzied. In Hungary, which had largely protected its Jewish population until 1944, the arrival of Adolf Eichmann and his Gestapo unit led to the deportation of over 400,000 Jews to Auschwitz in a matter of weeks. This operation, unprecedented in its speed and scale, showcased the terrifying efficiency of the Gestapo machinery. Eichmann himself boasted of deporting 12,000 Jews in a single day. Survivor Lily Ebert described the chaos. "We didn't know where we were going. We didn't know what was happening. We were treated worse than animals." Even as Allied bombs fell on German cities and Soviet troops pushed westward, the Gestapo continued its grim work. In the final months of the war, they oversaw death marches from camps threatened by Allied advances, leading to the deaths of thousands more. Their commitment to the Nazi cause remained unshakable to the bitter end. In April 1945, as Soviet troops approached Berlin, Gestapo chief Heinrich Müller was heard to say, "We'll win this war, but if we don't, I have no illusions. I'll be dead in 3 days." He subsequently disappeared, his fate remaining one of the great mysteries of the war's aftermath. Whispers in the darkness, the unsung heroes who defied Hitler's secret police. In the shadowy world of Nazi-occupied Europe, where every whisper could be a betrayal and every shadow concealed a potential informant, a brave few dared to stand against the tyranny of the Gestapo. These resistance fighters, armed with little more than courage and conviction, waged a silent war against one of history's most terrifying regimes. Among the most poignant examples of this resistance was the White Rose Group, a small circle of students and professors at the University of Munich. Led by siblings Hans and Sophie Scholl, along with their professor Kurt Huber, the group began their campaign of civil disobedience in June 1942. In the stifling atmosphere of Nazi Germany, where dissent was met with swift and brutal reprisal, The White Rose distributed leaflets calling for passive resistance against the Nazi regime. Sophie Scholl, just 21 years old when she was arrested, embodied the quiet bravery of the resistance. On February 18, 1943, as she and her brother scattered leaflets in the university's atrium, they were spotted by a janitor who reported them to the Gestapo. In the interrogation that followed, Sophie displayed remarkable courage. When asked why she had done it, she reportedly replied, "Somebody, after all, had to make a start. What we wrote and said is also believed by many others. They just don't dare express themselves as we did." The swift and merciless response of the Gestapo to the White Rose Group was typical of their approach to dissent. Just 4 days after their arrest, on February 22, 1943, Sophie, Hans, and their friend Christoph Probst were tried, convicted, and executed by guillotine. Professor Huber and other members of the group met the same fate shortly after, yet their sacrifice was not in vain. Their final leaflet, smuggled out of Germany, was later airdropped in the millions over German cities by Allied planes. While the White Rose Group operated within Germany itself, other resistance movements flourished in occupied territories. In France, the Réseau Shelburne, an escape network for Allied airmen shot down over occupied territory, operated under the constant threat of Gestapo infiltration. From November 1943 to August 1944, they successfully evacuated 167 Allied airmen from the coast of Brittany to England. The network's success was due in large part to the bravery of ordinary French citizens who risked everything to shelter and transport the airmen. Marie-Agnes Perron, a 24-year-old teacher who acted as a guide for the network, was arrested by the Gestapo on March 26, 1944. Despite brutal interrogation, she revealed nothing and was executed at Ravensbrück concentration camp on July 20, 1944. Her last letter home read, "I die for my country. I want France to be free." In Poland, where the Nazi occupation was particularly brutal, the resistance took on many forms. The Zagota, also known as the Council to Aid Jews, was unique among resistance movements in that its sole purpose was to save Jews from the Holocaust. Founded in December 1942, Zagota provided false documents, money, and safe houses to thousands of Jews in hiding. One of Zagota's most famous members was Irena Sendler, a social worker who used her position to enter the Warsaw Ghetto and smuggle out children. By the war's end, Sendler and her network had saved over 2,500 Jewish children. Arrested by the Gestapo in October 1943, Sendler was tortured but revealed nothing. She was sentenced to death but managed to escape when Zagota bribed her guards. The constant cat-and-mouse game between the resistance and the Gestapo led to the development of ingenious methods of communication and subterfuge. In Denmark, the resistance used the national radio to broadcast coded messages. A seemingly innocuous line in a news broadcast, such as, "The baker has no more bread," could signal an impending raid or the arrival of supplies. Perhaps one of the most audacious acts of resistance occurred in Norway on February 28, 1943. In what became known as Operation Gunnercide, a team of Norwegian commandos sabotaged the Vemork hydroelectric plant, which was producing heavy water for the Nazi nuclear weapons program. The success of this mission, carried out under the noses of the Gestapo and the SS Guards, significantly hampered the German atomic bomb project. Despite the constant threat of betrayal and the Gestapo's network of informants, many resistance members found strength in their faith or political convictions. In the Netherlands, Corrie ten Boom and her family hid Jews and resistance members in a secret room in their home. Arrested by the Gestapo in February 1944, Corrie survived Ravensbrück concentration camp and later wrote of her experiences, "There is no pit so deep that God's love is not deeper still." The story of the anti-Nazi resistance is also one of unlikely heroes. Georg Ferdinand Duckwitz, a German diplomat in occupied Denmark, leaked plans of an impending deportation of Danish Jews to the Danish resistance in September 1943. This allowed for the organization of a massive rescue operation, resulting in the evacuation of 7,220 Danish Jews to neutral Sweden. Despite the Gestapo's fearsome reputation and seemingly omnipresent surveillance, the resistance movements across Europe demonstrated the indomitable nature of the human spirit. From the distribution of underground newspapers to the sabotage of Nazi infrastructure, these brave men and women kept hope alive in the darkest of times. Their legacy lives on not just in history books, but in the very fabric of the societies they fought to preserve. As Sophie Scholl said in her final words before the Nazi court, "How can we expect righteousness to prevail when there is hardly anyone willing to give himself up individually to a righteous cause? Such a fine, sunny day, and I have to go. But what does my death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" The Shadows of Justice, unraveling the Gestapo's legacy in post-war trials. As the dust settled on the ruins of Hitler's Third Reich, the world turned its gaze to Nuremberg, where the architects of Nazi terror would face judgment for their crimes. Among those in the dock were the men who had wielded the fearsome power of the Gestapo, the secret police force that had been the iron fist of the Nazi regime. The Nuremberg trials, which began on November 20th, 1945, would become a watershed moment in international law, setting precedents that still reverberate today. As Winston Churchill famously declared, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." And now, those few would answer for their actions. In the Palace of Justice, a building that had miraculously survived the Allied bombing raids, sat Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking SS leader to face trial. As the former chief of the Reich Main Security Office, which oversaw the Gestapo, Kaltenbrunner embodied the brutality of the Nazi police state. His cold, calculating demeanor in the courtroom chilled even seasoned observers. When confronted with evidence of his crimes, including the murder of millions in concentration camps, Kaltenbrunner's response was chilling in its banality. "I have only done my duty as an intelligence organ, and I refuse to serve as an ersatz for Hitler and Himmler." Kaltenbrunner's trial, which lasted from January 2nd to October 1st, 1946, exposed the intricate web of terror he had helped weave. The trials exposed the intricate machinery of terror that the Gestapo had operated. Witnesses recounted tales of midnight arrests, torture in dank cellars, and the ever-present fear that permeated occupied Europe. One such witness, a former Gestapo prisoner named Marie-Claude Vaillant-Couturier, testified about the horrors she had witnessed in Auschwitz. Her words painted a vivid picture of the consequences of unchecked police power. There was a room in Block 25 where they put the babies born in the camp and the children under 6. They received practically nothing to eat. They died like flies. Vaillant-Couturier's testimony on January 28, 1946, lasted for hours, leaving many in the courtroom visibly shaken. As the trials progressed, a complex picture emerged of the Gestapo's role in the Nazi regime. It became clear that the organization had been more than just a police force. It had been the very embodiment of Nazi ideology, ruthlessly crushing dissent and enforcing racial policies. The testimony of Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz, revealed the chilling efficiency with which the Gestapo had carried out its tasks. Höss matter-of-factly described the process of mass murder, stating, "I commanded Auschwitz until the 1st of December 1943, and estimate that at least 2,500,000 victims were executed and exterminated there by gassing and burning." Höss's testimony, given on April 15, 1946, provided crucial evidence of the Gestapo's direct involvement in the Holocaust. The Nuremberg trials were not the only venue where former Gestapo officials faced justice. Across Europe, national courts conducted their own proceedings. In France, the trial of Klaus Barbie, known as the Butcher of Lyon, captivated the nation in 1987. Barbie, who had evaded justice for decades with the help of American intelligence services, finally faced his accusers, Among them was Lisa Lesevre, who testified about her torture at Barbie's hands. "He broke me. I think he wanted to destroy me, and in a way he succeeded." The trial, which began on May 11, 1987 in Lyon, also heard from Simone Lagrange, who was just 13 when Barbie tortured her and deported her family to Auschwitz. Her testimony brought the courtroom to tears. The legacy of the Gestapo trials extended far beyond the courtroom. They sparked a global conversation about the nature of evil and the responsibilities of individuals within authoritarian systems. The defense of following orders was rejected by the tribunals, establishing the principle that individuals could be held accountable for their actions even when operating under a chain of command. This principle would go on to shape international law and ethics in the decades to come. As the Nuremberg prosecutor Benjamin Ferencz later reflected, "Law, not war. That's what I've stood for. Law, not war. We must have international law and enforcement mechanisms to prevent aggression and protect human rights." However, the pursuit of justice was not always straightforward. Many former Gestapo officials managed to slip through the cracks, some even finding new roles in post-war intelligence agencies. The case of Heinz Pfeffer, a former Gestapo officer who later worked for West German intelligence, highlighted the complex moral compromises of the Cold War era. When Pfeffer was exposed as a Soviet double agent in 1961, it raised uncomfortable questions about the rehabilitation of Nazi-era officials. Another notorious case was that of Klaus Barbie, who worked for US intelligence after the war before fleeing to Bolivia, where he lived openly until his extradition to France in 1983. The trials also had a profound impact on how societies viewed the role of police and state surveillance. The revelations of the Gestapo's methods led to a heightened awareness of the dangers of unchecked state power. In West Germany, this translated into strict limitations on police authority and a strong emphasis on civil liberties. The Basic Law of 1949 explicitly forbade the creation of a federal police force with powers similar to those of the Gestapo. Article 1 of this constitution famously declared, "Human dignity shall be inviolable," a direct response to the Gestapo's disregard for human rights. Yet, as time passed, the memory of the Gestapo began to take on mythic proportions. Popular culture often portrayed Gestapo agents as almost supernatural villains, omniscient and omnipresent. This image, while exaggerated, reflected the very real trauma inflicted by the organization. As historian Robert Gelatelli noted, the Gestapo was, for many Germans, the sinister embodiment of Nazi terror. Its reputation for brutality and omniscience was deliberately cultivated by the regime. Films like The Night Porter, 1974, and Marathon Man, 1976, further cemented the Gestapo's place in the public imagination as the ultimate symbol of totalitarian oppression. In the end, the post-war trials of Gestapo officials did more than just punish the guilty. They helped to establish a new international legal order and set standards for human rights that continue to be relevant today. As Justice Robert H. Jackson, the chief U.S. prosecutor at Nuremberg, eloquently stated in his opening address on November 21, 1945, that 4 great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. As we close this chapter of history, the shadow of the Gestapo looms large, a stark reminder of humanity's capacity for both bureaucratic efficiency and unfathomable cruelty. From the cobblestone streets of Berlin to the gates of Auschwitz, their invisible hand shaped the fate of millions. Heinrich Himmler's chilling words still echo through time. "We have the moral right, we had the duty to our people to do it, to kill this people who wanted to kill us." Yet, in the face of such evil, we also remember the courage of those who resisted. People like Sophie Scholl of the White Rose movement, executed by the Gestapo in 1943 at just 21 years old. As we bid farewell, let us heed the words of Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel. "For the dead and the living, we must bear witness. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the annals of human tragedy and resilience. May we never forget, and may we always strive to be the light that dispels such darkness.